Welcome to the Vikings Now. I am your host, Patrick Seatman. We got a fun video today. We're going to be talking about some Minnesota Vikings trade targets. The NFL trade deadline is just around 3 weeks away, and I expect our Minnesota Vikings to be buyers at the trade deadline. And I got 5 names that I'll be going over in today's video on guys that potentially could be joining the Minnesota Vikings during this NFL season. But before we get into that, sub for dubs. Listen, the Vikings are on a 3-game winning streak. This channel's hot. You guys have been subscribing like crazy, and I know I ask you guys all the time, but really, it is one of the best ways to help me out and help this Vikings community grow. So we are currently at 6,173 subs. My goal for this video, let's just get to 6,200. And then if you are subscribed, I missed being at at Vikings home games this year and seeing the Skol chant getting going in the stadium. So I want to flood this comment section with Skols. If you are a subscriber, type Skol down below, and whoever comments Skol the most, I'll get you a shout out on the next video at the beginning of it. So if you are subscribed, go type Skol down below. First name I have up here, CJ Henderson. The Carolina Panthers yesterday, pretty breaking news. They did fire their head coach, so I think a lot of Carolina Panthers could be on the trade block. But if you're talking about CJ Henderson, he was drafted 9th overall in the 2020 NFL draft. A comparison I saw coming out of the draft was Carlos Rogers. Carlos Rogers, if you guys don't remember, he was a Pro Bowl corner back in the day in the early 2000s to mid 2010s. He was a freak athlete just like CJ Henderson. CJ Henderson, listen, this guy's an incredible athlete. He ran a 4.39 40-yard dash during his NFL Combine debut. And he also had 20 reps on the bench press, which is pretty impressive. Corners and wide receivers, they rep out 185 pounds. He was able to do that 20 times, which is pretty incredible. It kind of speaks to the athlete what he is. But so far this year, CJ Henderson, he struggled. If we go take a look at Pro Football Focus and their grades, he only rates out at an 46.0 overall. His run defense is kind of the best part of his game so far this year at a 69 rating, but that coverage grade, 41.4. So he hasn't been living up to the 1st or the 9th overall expectations he has. Now, if you're looking at some of his specific stats, he's been targeted only 16 times. He's given up 12 receptions on those 16 targets for 149 yards, only 1 pass breakup, and 0 interceptions. So if you talk about him living up to the expectation of being a first-round pick and being the 9th overall selection in that draft, he hasn't really lived up to it. But why I do think he could be on the move, the Panthers could be having a fire sale right now. You know, I've heard the chatter of DJ Moore, their wide receiver, potentially being on the trade block, and they did fire Matt Rule yesterday, who was their former head coach. So I think they could be huge sellers at this trade deadline. I actually have a corner coming up right after this that the Vikings, on the Panthers, who the Vikings could also be trading for. But I'll make this the pin comment on today's video. Would you want the Vikings to trade for Henderson? Obviously, he was the 9th overall pick, so I think it will have to take maybe a 4th, 5th, and maybe even a 3rd-round pick to get this guy. But he's a freak athlete and has true lockdown corner potential. So what say you? Would you trade for CJ Henderson? Type T for trade, type P for pass. Another Carolina Panthers corner I'm going to be talking about, Jaycee Horn. He was one of my favorite corners coming out of last year's draft. And so far this year, he's been pretty solid. He's been targeted 18 times, only giving up 7 receptions, really night and day compared to his buddy CJ Henderson, but 14 solo tackles. He's actually great in the run game with 2 pass breakups and an interception. The reason I want to start off with 2 corners on today's video is because we're looking at the Vikings depth chart, especially their cornerback depth chart here. Patrick Peterson, he's been okay this year. Cameron Dantzler, shout out to you, won us the Bears game, but he has kind of stepped up and has been playing better the past 2 games. Chandon Sullivan, he's been good in the slot, but I do think if you're looking at this Vikings CB depth chart, you could consolidate some assets and go get a true lockdown corner. But I'm curious what you guys have to say. What is the Vikings' biggest need? I think a lot of people may say interior defensive line or secondary, but I definitely think it's on the defensive side of the football. But what do you think? What is the Vikings' biggest need? Personally, if I'm trading for a position, like I said, if I'm going to consolidate some assets, just like I know Kwesi Adolfo-Menso will make some trades during the NFL trade deadline period, if he's going to make a trade, personally, I would make it for a corner. That's why I had these first two names being CJ Henderson and Jaycee Horn. I would go after a corner over a couple other position groups. But another guy I think the Vikings could trade for, who's on the trade block, Daron Payne. So if it's not a corner I'm trading for, I'd probably trade for a defensive tackle. I honestly love Daron Payne. I think he's got that tenacity. I think he's got that kind of explosiveness you want from interior defensive linemen, and I think he's just a block eater. I think he's a guy, he may not blow you off the screen with the stats, with the TFLs and all that, but I think he will help a Vikings defense who has struggled so far this year. Listen, we're giving up yards like crazy. Even though the points per game is only sitting at 20.4, 14th in the league, but total yards at 383 a game, then I'm still concerned over the Vikings rush defense. Because giving up 120 yards rushing per game, I think if you add a guy like Daron Payne to this Vikings defensive line, I think it could be a huge help. Because, hey, Harrison Phillips, shout out to him. He's played great this year. Dalvin Tomlinson, he's played pretty strong as well. And then Ross Blacklock has honestly filled in and been a good piece. But I think this team needs depth there. And I think Daron Payne kind of has that pop, kind of has that star power for this defense. And I think he could be a huge addition for the Minnesota Vikings. And honestly, my overall takeaway with the defensive line, you can never have too much depth. You look at the Rams and you look at the Buccaneers the past 2 years. I always talk about this. The Rams and Bucs past 2 seasons, specifically the Rams last year, they had Aaron Donald and Leonard Floyd. What did they do? They went out and traded for Von Miller, and that was probably one of the biggest reasons why they won the Super Bowl last year. I think the Vikings, obviously their biggest need is on the defensive side of the football. And I think if you're thinking about trading for D linemen, even though the D line has been solid this year, it's just adding extra icing on your cake. I do think the Vikings, they should go out and make a move for a defensive lineman if it's not a corner. Now, I want to give a shout out to our proud sportsbook sponsor, BetUS. If you go to chatsports.com/bet and use promo code CHAT125, you're going to get a 125% deposit bonus. You may be asking, what does that really mean? So if you put $100 into your account, you're going to get $125 that you can do whatever you want with. It's honestly a great deal. So if you put $100 in, you'll have $225 total to play with. And if you're looking at what to bet on this week, the Vikings are 3-point favorites against the Dolphins in Miami, with the over-under being 45.5. I'm leaning Vikings, obviously, in this game. I think they could pick up their 4th straight victory. But honestly, the over of 45.5 against the Dolphins offense, against the Vikings offense, I think that's where I'm going to lay my money. So go to chatsports.com/bet and use promo code CHAT125. Another corner on this list, because I think this is definitely the Vikings' biggest need. Sidney Jones. Sidney Jones is the corner for the Seattle Seahawks, and he's had a pretty solid start to this year, but he could be on the trade block. Seattle, they addressed the secondary in this past year's draft, and I think he could just be another player that maybe, he deserves reps in this offense, but I do think Seattle is going to give reps to guys like Tariq Woolen and some of their other rookies. So far this year, PFF, we check out how they graded him out. 55.2 overall, run defense 67.2, and a coverage grade of 51.1. I think this is just another guy. Yes, he may not be the true lockdown potential that guys like CJ Henderson and Jaycee Horn have, but he could definitely be a really strong depth piece, especially with the Caleb Evans now being in concussion protocols for the Minnesota Vikings. I do think Sidney Jones could be a sneaky candidate the Vikings could go out and trade for. But I want you guys, go down and pick a corner. Obviously, Sidney Jones, you wouldn't need to give up maybe a 3rd, 4th, and 5th round pick. It'll probably be maybe a late round swap. CJ Henderson and Jaycee Horn, like I mentioned, those guys are going to demand a lot more draft capital from the Vikings. But I want to know what you guys have to say. With all that being said, pick a corner. Sidney Jones, type SJ, CJ Henderson, type CH, and Jaycee Horn, type JH down below. I would love to hear what you guys have to say. Clelin Ferrell from the Las Vegas Raiders is next up on my list. He's an edge. And I do think, listen, Danielle Hunter and Zadarius Smith, they've been okay this year. Danielle Hunter finally had a sack last week, but both of them do have some injury history. And I'm not saying that they are going to get injured. This is not me saying you got to prepare for the worst. But having depth at that position is huge. And I think with the Vikings, if you're looking at the bright spots on this Vikings roster, it's all on the edge. And especially on the defensive line and with the edge group, I think you're going to need to win a couple of these games in the trenches, especially coming up. Listen, the Dolphins game, they got a lot of flashy guys on the outside. It's going to be a battle on the perimeter. But I do think eventually you're going to get into a grudge match against either the Packers, Bears, or Lions, because the Vikings, they still have to go to Chicago, to Green Bay, and to Detroit. Those interdivisional games are normally that kind of rough and rowdy atmosphere. So I do think the Vikings, if you're going to pick up a couple of these guys, have them be on the defensive side of football, and more specifically, be in the trenches. You can never have too much depth on the defensive line. So I think go trade for a corner or a defensive lineman or a defensive edge. Really, I just think the defensive side of the football needs some upgrades. If you guys made it to the end of the video, you guys are a real one. I love hearing the real one roll call down in the chat. It really shows, like, if you're really watching to the end of the video, you're clearly a diehard Vikings fan. You're clearly a diehard fan of the show, and I really appreciate it. So if you did make it to the end of the video, type real one down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, like always, and let's go Vikes.